Some supporters of diplomatic relations between Israel and the UAE say this will help in preventing the annexation of the occupied West Bank. But is that really so? And are other Arab countries likely to embrace Israel anytime soon? I talked to Roey Gilad, Israel's charge d'affaires in Turkey. Mr. Gilad, has the UAE agreed to establish diplomatic relations with Israel on the condition that Israel is going to permanently scrap any plans to annex the West Bank?
Well, the official position is that the annexation plan is suspended, is postponed, but not permanently put off.
What does it mean it's postponed and not permanently put off? For how long?
I cannot give you an exact timetable, and I think this was one of the preconditions of the UAE to establish normal relationship with Israel. Israel agreed for the time being. I cannot tell you for how long this will last. I cannot tell you that might become permanent eventually. But currently Israel has agreed to suspend the annexation plan, which might become permanent or not.
Is that uncertainty strategic in nature, or is it the case that the Israeli government has uncertainty, it doesn't really know how long it might be suspended for?
Look, I'm not into the details, so I can tell you that it was postponed or suspended for a certain time. I can only tell you that overall the annexation initiative caused also a domestic row in Israel. There were many people that supported it and many people that were against it. So it was also a domestic issue in Israel. Not everybody supported it. It was, by the way, an American initiative. And when the Americans came to us and said, we suggest that let's postpone it for the time being, we have agreed.
So what were the conditions that were agreed between Israel and the UAE in particular, or perhaps conditions that Americans pushed that you guys agreed to and the UAE also agreed to? What were those conditions?
The relationship between us and the Gulf states in general and UAE in particular goes way, way back. And I think we have a significant relationship with the UAE without the, I would say, the official seal. What we have now is the official agreement that is there to cement relationships that are going already for a long time. I think it was very important for the three parties. It was very important for the US to bring Israel and UAE together, two strategic important partners of the USA in the Middle East. Obviously, it was important for us to sign the third peace agreement with an Arab state after Egypt in 1978 and Jordan in 1994. And I think it was also important for the UAE, not only because of the suspension of the annexation program initiative, but also to establish relationship with what they consider to be a very strong strategic partner in the Middle East. You know that the UAE, just like Israel, consider Iran to be a strategic enemy. And I think the Iranian factor, not less than the annexation one, was another element that pushed the UAE to agree on a peace agreement with Israel. And there are other many bilateral issues. You know, Israel is a beacon of high-tech in the Middle East. I think UAE is very much interested to be part of it. So I think it would be wrong to say that this is only because of the annexation. The suspension of the annexation initiative, it has to do with Iran, it has to do with bilateral relationship, and I think it's a win-win for the US, for Israel, and for the UAE.
When you talk about the Iranian threat, Saudi Arabia perhaps feels more threatened by Iran than the UAE does. So is that rationale not being used by Saudi Arabia to establish diplomatic ties with Israel?
I think Saudi Arabia, being the huge state it is, with its influence in the Arab world and the Muslim world, you know, the Organization of Islamic Conference is based in Jeddah. I think they can, you know, it's like a huge ship that it takes some time to turn, while the UAE is like a smaller boat that it can move much faster. I think this is, if you ask me, Hassan, that's the main difference between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But I think in the long run, and don't ask me now what is the long run, we can see also Saudi Arabia joining this, I would say, group of Arab states in the Middle East that understands that by having normal relationship with Israel can influence much better, first of all, the future of the Palestinian track, and also face much more successfully the challenge that is coming from Iran.
Well, I won't ask you about the long run, but Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman likes to see himself as the reformer. Are you expecting him to take the initiative to normalize diplomatic relations with Israel?
We definitely want him to do it. We can see how this is going to serve the interest of Saudi Arabia. But as I said before, and I think it was reflected by Saudi's seniors when they were asked about the UAE-Israel agreement, they did not criticize it, but they hinted that what the UAE can do, Saudi Arabia cannot do because of the size, because of the extra importance that Saudi Arabia has in the Muslim and the Arab world. But again, I believe that in the future, also Saudi Arabia will follow the steps of the UAE.
Let's talk a bit about Jerusalem. Why is Israel insisting on viewing it as an undivided capital when clearly there's so much sensitivity surrounding it, and when clearly there are other options that could perhaps be more palatable? Why insist on Jerusalem being the undivided capital?
I think, I don't know how good you know Israel, Hassan, but there are very few issues in Israel that are not in debate, that very few things in Israel that enjoy a consensus. Like I told you before, even that the Annexation initiative did not enjoy a consensus in Israel. But one of the very few things that enjoys a wide consensus in Israel, right wing, left wing, at least among the Jewish people, is that Jerusalem should be the undivided capital of the state of Israel. However, the religious rights of the Muslims and the Christian is going to be protected in Jerusalem.
You're not protecting those rights even at the moment.
No, why? Why do you say so?
Just look at the condition the Arabs in particular face at the moment. They're arguably living in a modern day concentration camp.
No, actually, the truth is exactly the opposite. You know that currently Muslims can't pray in Al-Aqsa, while Jews can only visit the mountain without the ability of praying. And this, by the way, irritates many Jewish people that say this is the place where we had the Solomon Mosque, the Solomon Temple, and yet we cannot pray in this place.
Well, the reality is that, let's look at the people of Gaza. They're basically trapped. The sea they have, you control it. Even aid does not get to them without your permission. They cannot even move around from territories that are supposed to be theirs. They receive second or third class citizen treatment. Is that something they're supposed to rejoice over?
I think what's happening in Gaza is a tragedy. Let it be very clear. When Israel pulled back, let me remind you that Israel pulled back from Gaza in 2005. The Palestinian Authority was defeated by the Hamas in 2006. Then the Hamas took over militarily the Gaza by throwing PA activists from the building roofs. I think you know the story. We are facing a very serious challenge in Gaza. Gaza is being dominated, controlled by a terror organization, Hamas, that unfortunately your government has a very close dialogue with. You know, often I'm being asked about the Hamas, and I see that people here do not actually realize. And I always compare it with the PKK. The PKK is a serious challenge to this country, but it is a separatist challenge. It's a secessionist challenge. PKK doesn't want to establish its state instead of Turkey, but next to it. While the Hamas says very clearly that there is no room for a Jewish sovereign entity in the Middle East, and the Hamas-led state should be established instead of the state of Israel.
There really is no comparison between Hamas and the PKK, is there? I mean, in the case of PKK, there was no context of the Balfour Declaration coming in, people finding their home occupied, and when they resist, they're branded a terrorist organization. They're not even given the right to defend themselves. So I think, isn't it a bit unfair to compare these two?
I think the main problem, and as I said before, I know Palestinians from both sides are very bitter about the state of Israel, as we are very bitter with the Palestinians as well. But Israel is facing actually two Palestinian coalitions currently, and I think that's the main problem. We face one coalition in Ramallah, and we face another coalition in Gaza. While the first coalition in Ramallah, I think is willing, but unfortunately is unable. The second coalition in Gaza is maybe able, but unwilling. And I don't think they're ever going to be willing to establish some agreement with Israel.
When you talk about the Zionists accepting the offer and the Palestinians not accepting them, you're making the assumption that the occupier and the occupied, the oppressor and the oppressed are the same. Isn't that causing the problems?
No, I think in 1937, 1947, Jews were much weaker than the Palestinians. I think it's mainly by...
a state was imposed on the Palestinians.
A state
post-First World War, the Balfour Declaration, the way things unfolded. This was an imposition.
No, after the war, when they lost the war, a war that they've started as part of the rejection of the UN partition plan, they rejected the plan, they lost the war. What else can you expect from us?
Mr. Gilad, you see the problem here is that one can disagree on how to pursue with something. For example, you might have those Palestinians who might see that a purely political process might be the way forward, and those who feel that they have to use force. But the ground reality is that when you're completely disregarding Hamas as a terrorist organization, you seem to be ignoring the ground realities, such as Israel is a highly militarized society. Your settlers, when they go and illegally capture Palestinian land, they're carrying, even an Israeli farmer is carrying an Uzi submachine gun with him as he captures illegally the Palestinian territory. And they often shoot the Palestinians. So you're really denying the Palestinians even the right to defend themselves. This is something you seem to be finding very hard to acknowledge.
I think the depiction of Israel as a military society is very wrong. Israel is a very civil society with very strong economy, with very strong international status, with very strong civil society. Am I happy with everything that is happening vis-a-vis the Palestinians? Of course not, like most Israelis. But the picture that is, if Israelis are not interested in finding a solution to this conflict, to this bitter conflict, is very wrong. In the government, you have few elements. You have the Likud, which is right-wing. You have blue and white, which is left-center. And I think they both reflect a consensus that a solution to this bitter conflict needs to be found, but such a solution that will strike a balance between answering Palestinian national needs or requests and Israeli security needs. It's not easy to strike this balance. Israel is there to stay, hopefully in a peaceful relationship with our neighbors, the Palestinians.
Mr. Gilad, good to have you on TRT World.
Thank you very much for hosting me, sir.